Okay, I think we could go ahead and get started. So, welcome. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our NASA Wellness and Health Promotion Knowledge Community webinar today on effectively engaging male identifying students as a health promotion professional. My name is Marlena Woodman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Wellness and Health Promotion KC Professional Development Co-Manager. As our presenters, Dr. Steve Rissman and Matt Stefanko are sharing information. Feel free to use the Q&A and chat feature to ask your questions, and we will also have plenty of time at the end to ask questions as well. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded, and now I'm going to pass it over to Steve and Matt to introduce themselves and get us started.
Matt, do you want to advance that first slide? I'll kind of tell, or do you want to jump in and talk? Do you want to introduce yourself now?
I'll do my intro when I go. So why don't you go ahead?
Great.
Yeah, all good.
Sounds great. Well, I am Dr. Steve Rissman. I am a professor at Metropolitan State University of Denver, and I work in the Department of Health Professions. We have a program in integrative healthcare, which I've been teaching in for, oh gosh, a good long time, 25 years, something like that. And in about 2005, I developed a men's health program, or men's health class, sorry, recognizing that there was really very little out there in terms of curriculum regarding men's health. Will Courtney out of Stanford did a lot of the early work at discussing the abysmal health of men and really comparatively the comparisons of men's health, women's health, the fact that men were living 7 times at that time, 7 years, sorry, shorter lives than women. And why was that? So there was early work on that, and I thought, gosh, I'm going to develop a class on that. And so that class has been going for a lot of years. I was really puzzled again as to why weren't we really addressing this disparity and other aspects of groups or cultures. We would probably have jumped on that a little bit quicker. And the question is, why is that? There was a thought at the time, and there still sort of is, that men are fine. We've been talking about men for many, many years, and perhaps there's no need. There's just some differences. And so anyway, I developed that course. I had 18 men and 2 women. It was a very interesting experiment. And since that time, I've developed men across cultures. So looking through the cultural lens of what cultural influences there are on the health behaviors and health outcomes of men. I developed a course in anger because we recognize that is something that men struggle with. It was the language we gave them for their emotional outlet, and then we took it away and said no more angry men, but we didn't really replace it with healthy emotional intelligence. I have since developed a class on aging warriors, which I'm currently teaching, and a fathers in health, looking at how fathers have a much more significant impact on the health of children than they thought, and that fathering itself has a significant health impact, both positively and negatively, on fathers. Since that time, I developed a men's health minor, the only minor that exists in the country. So we have to continue asking ourselves, why is that? Why is it that there are no other academic minors in men's health? And I've subsequently developed a digital badge where men can show their competency. I'm also a naturopathic physician. I work with men and boys in my practice. Go ahead, Matthew. So if we look at the state of American men in 2024, here are a few statistics. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can kind of take a look at some of these, but 30% of men not hanging out with anyone outside of their house. Clearly, 1/3 of men. I have a few of them in my practice that they don't really leave the house. We see that in Japanese culture with hikikomori, this isolation, and this isolation is a significant factor in why we want to work with men on college campuses as well. But 1 in 6, no social activities, a decrease of men entering the labor force, decreases of men entering college, graduating from college, etc. So go ahead, and I'm not going to go through all those, Matthew. I want to just sort of move through here. And so then what's the reflection on men's health? Well, we know that even currently, men's life expectancy is 6 years less than women, that men are 4 times more likely to die of suicide. I was looking back at my notes from over 20 years ago. The statistic was the same, and that is an outrage. Again, if we had another group in our society that was committing suicide at 4 times the rate of any other population, we would be asking ourselves why. Finally, we're getting a little bit of traction, and those of you that are here today are probably interested in, what do we need to do here? And so, you can look through. They're not getting as much sleep. We have a drop in testosterone. We have significant issues in terms of male body image, secondary to a lack of inner self, that, from my perspective, lack of inner self need to build up on the outer self, that compensation for what's not happening underneath. Jump to the next slide there, Matthew. It doesn't, you're all probably aware of the numerous articles coming out. Look at this. This is 2021 through 2023. And there are 2024 articles as well on where are all the men in college. We have this lack of engagement. And I would highly recommend taking a look at Christine Emba's article. She writes for the Washington Post. And she has some audio discussing some of the issues of where men are, what some of those issues are, as well as Richard Reeves, his new book on about boys and men, and a few others. So, you don't have to go very far to see that we have an issue, and especially we had this issue across campus. Earlier years ago, when I was talking to people about this, there was some, recognition that, oh yeah, I have a nephew or a neighbor who's he doesn't seem to be doing as well, and now you can't really talk to anybody without recognizing that, boy, there's the young men are not engaging in even in high school, isolating, and that carries off into college as well. Go ahead and advance that next slide. I'm probably just gonna. Yeah, and so we know that that one of the issues on campus is not, how men engage, and they don't ask for help. They don't follow traditional models of health, in terms of engaging a wellness center or a counseling center. The numbers are just not there. And we see this, we've been seeing this for a long time. Less likely, men are less likely to seek help. And that's that whole old mantra of men are not to be vulnerable. We were socialized as boys not to be vulnerable. And so then you're asking us to be vulnerable and call up someplace and that we're really uncomfortable with and engage. It just isn't happening. Matthew, go ahead to the next slide. So one of the issues that is a little bit challenging to talk about is in traditional masculine norms, the idea of masculine was not feminine. This is rooted in two issues. One is fear of the feminine. A lot of men don't have comfortability with the feminine. And I don't think a lot of us would look at this and say, oh gosh, what's going on? What's the matter with women? Why are men not comfortable there? And why are they turning away? The more women show up to college, the more men get the message, this is not someplace I'm supposed to be. And I think the truth of it is, it's not just about women. It's really about they're looking for male role models, male mentors. We have a lack of that in our society, and I think that we can look at that, and I think that that's actually a more of the issue than simply just the fear of the feminine. James Hollis talked about the fear of the feminine in his book, Under Saturn's Shadow. It's been out for over 20 years. and still continues to. But we recognize equally that that healthy masculine is oftentimes what we don't see. Would you go ahead and jump to that next slide, Matthew? So, what are some of the solutions from my perspective? Well, increasing this awareness of the needs of our male students, recognizing that, taking a look at some of these articles, taking a look at these statistics and saying, wow, that's an issue. When I have people come into the classes that I've been teaching for, like I said, over 20 years, oftentimes women will come into the class and their early comments are, wow, I didn't know that men also struggled, and that men have these insecurities, and that men feel shame, and that men are isolated. So it really takes an understanding, and not simply labeling their behaviors, but understanding the root of their behaviors. This ugly phrase of toxic masculinity, as Reeves points out in his book, it really does shame masculinity, and keeping the two words together as that. And that's what we want to get away from. We want to invite men not to label or put a label on their behaviors, but invite men to a more healthy perspective. And that requires men seeing models of healthy masculinity. I really like to get away from the idea, and I use this in my classes, getting away from the idea of male is masculine, female is feminine, but rather the idea, I mean, that's maybe how the households were a century ago, but really the understanding now that we have masculine and feminine within all of us, and that one feeds the other, that the yin feeds the yang, to use the Taoist model, that they have a relationship, and that it's a moving Tai Chi looking kind of energy. And I think that goes a long way towards getting rid of the shaming and inviting more curiosity about healthy masculinity. Again, I think we need more programming. I certainly am, I'm one of the only ones out there. I am the only men's health program that exists, and I would welcome opportunity to foster and mentor others in developing some men's health courses. And then understanding that men don't go the traditional route. I think that this is why I brought in Manual, and the university contracts with Manual so that all our male identifying students have access to that. And Matthew will be talking about that. And then also in terms of funding, increasing institutional investment, because clearly there is need to support men. It's important that men are well, that men are entering college, and then men are graduating from college and entering the workforce from a more healthy perspective. And so we need a multi-pronged approach to doing so. These are some of the suggestions that I have. But I think that's what I have at this point, and I'd be happy to take questions at the end. Jump in there, Matthew.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Steve. And I really appreciate you kind of laying the groundwork. And I really am happy that Marlena, Jack, et cetera, invited us kind of into this space. Really my focus is going to be a little bit less on sort of what the Manual program is, although that is the sort of perspective and lens that I bring to the conversation, and really more about some of the data that we're seeing. Obviously, I think similar to Steve, we are excited about what we're building and how that can be applied elsewhere. But at the same time, I think we'd be equally excited, if not more excited, if all of your institutions developed their own strategies or other, that's really why we're excited to be here. And so hopefully most of my conversation and points will sort of touch on that. A little bit about my background and sort of how I got into the space. I think, like Steve said, I was one of those unhealthy men that he was probably seeing in the data 20 or 30 years ago. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota. I grew up with a lot of men around me with very sort of traditional, ideals. We weren't having a lot of active conversations about our emotions, how we were doing, et cetera. I struggled with mental illness myself from a very young age, never got help for it, didn't have a name for it, went to college like a lot of young men, continued to not get help for it. I was sort of unfortunately introduced to substances and alcohol being a way that I felt like I could cope with that anxiety, whether that be sort of relational or otherwise. And it wasn't until I was 22, 23 where I got, really very lucky in that I had forces sort of pushing and encouraging me to reach out for help. And I started going to therapy. I started meditating, like things that when I was growing up watching the Minnesota Vikings, for lack of a better term, I would have never, for lack of a better sort of approach, would have never thought I would go and, I'm going to sit in a room for 10 minutes and there's going to be rain sounds and I'm going to, feel better at the end of that. Right. And so my life improved quite a bit. I felt very lucky. I wanted to give that back to people. And so I've been in the nonprofit and public sector space around mental and behavioral health ever since. I actually started my career in Baltimore City's health department, leading their opioid policy response. I spent a period of time here in DC, which is where I'm based at Planned Parenthood. I think much of the way we think about Manual is like, what would happen if men had a productive space that they could go to in the way that women have Planned Parenthood or other sort of resource centers, et cetera. What would our world look like if every time men were in a place where they had to make hard decisions or they had to take care of their health, they could go there versus sort of internalize that, right? So and then I did some work in sort of health promotion, more broadly. I was noticing a lot of the same data that Steve was seeing, and really seeing a lot of things that started coming up in my life, my family, my siblings, the people that were close to me, and felt like I think much of what Steve saw, there were these sort of two things coming up at the same time to me. One is that in a lot of these very progressive spaces, we were identifying men as the problem. And at the same time, we were not saying, let's go invest in solutions to fix those problems upstream, right? And so it felt like we were doing a lot of investment downstream, which is important. And I think people like Steve and myself would argue that those things need to continue. But at the same time, if you want to break the cycle, you also need to invest in the people that may be perpetrating many or some of the challenges. And I think that's sort of the case we're trying to make. So I'll move through this relatively quickly. We started Manual a couple of years ago. If you're not familiar with it, it is a program intended to support college-aged men or male-identifying students. We work with a little over 40 institutions, around 50,000 men. So we've grown really quickly. And like I said, if there's interest in learning more about the program, I'm happy to talk about it at a different time. But really, I want to focus on what are we seeing with those 50,000 men across 40 institutions. It's a diverse set of institutions. It's HBCUs, it's community colleges, it's R1s, it's really the full gamut, commuter colleges, like MSU-Denver, et cetera. So, we have a fairly diverse set of perspectives that men are bringing. I mean, one thing that Steve mentioned is there has been a really big, meaningful uptick over the last 1 or 2 years. And I can just speak anecdotally, when we're working with young men across a lot of these college campuses, like we were working in Greek life, we're working with men of color, et cetera. Like we're having conversations with young guys who are, I think, much more willing to have these conversations than they were in 2015, 2016, 2017, or even the late, 2010s, early 2020s. And so one kind of point I would take from this is saying that, like, if you tried something like this 5 years ago and it didn't get the traction you thought that it should have at that point, I do think things have shifted quite substantially over the last couple of years. And you might find a more inviting atmosphere, environment, et cetera, today than you did a few years ago to sort of work on this. I want to identify some of sort of the supports that we sort of see in the context of higher education, right? And these are the supports that are the vendors, and these are the resource centers. But I think if you look internally at your academic advising data, your counseling therapy data, et cetera, you're going to see that 70 to 90% utilization kind of split, even if it's a gender neutral service. And so one of the things that we often talk about, whether it be Manual or anything else, is if you have a service that is gender neutral, let's call that counseling, but 85% of the people using it are female identifying students, then you may have less of a gender neutral program than you have and something that's actually working for a specific audience and not others. And then, of course, there's some really incredible programs that support female identifying students, whether that be organizations like Planned Parenthood, which are in and around a lot of college campuses, or a lot of institutions have women's resource centers. And we at Manual, we're not shy to say that we stole a lot of the foundational, like the ideas that women's resource centers and LGBTQ plus resource centers, the idea of creating really healthy, productive, safe spaces for populations that have unique challenges that require intervention to be successful in the collegiate environment. Like we take a lot of those ideas and say, how do we apply that in the context of male identifying students? And so one of the things that I talk about with a lot of colleges is I think we have a playbook, right? I think that higher education has a playbook to say, we have identity groups that need additional support. What do we do with those groups? We give them more programming, we invest in them, we figure out how to get people like those student groups in front of them, all the things that Steve were talking about. We have a pretty well documented example. Of course, there's changes and things that need to be made with male identifying students, but for the most part, we've got a good playbook for other student groups. The problem is we tend to not apply that in this context. And so I think one of the things I would invite you to do is say, what are we doing for other sort of specific student groups that need specific or special support? What would that look like if we applied a version of that to this, this group? A little bit about manual very quickly. I'm going to move through this in like 30 seconds. A lot of the emphasis is very similar to what Steve, recommended. We want to meet guys on topics that they care about, right? I think one of the challenges with things like mental health, with well-being, et cetera, is we often can lose young men right away, right? If you've been taught for 20 years to not be vulnerable, to not ask for help, and you feel like getting mental health care is asking for help and being vulnerable, day one, you're going to push that away. And so how do you have topics and content and areas, whether it's manual or anything else, right? How do you talk to these guys about their nutrition, their physical fitness, their sleep? I had a health and well-being, promotion director talk to me, and he said, what's the one place where men are going on college campuses more than women? The only place that he could identify, and it was their gym, their physical fitness center, right? So if that's not a core part of your strategy, meeting guys there, then you might not be in a good position to meet men where they are. And then, of course, Steve referenced the idea of male role modeling, right? But how do we get more young men in front of other young men saying it's okay to ask for help, it's okay to not be okay? I mean, one of the really big challenges we see in higher education, and I encourage you to look at your own institution, is go look at the counseling department, see how many female identifying counselors you have versus male identifying counselors. How many of those are Black or Hispanic male counselors, right? Most human beings want to meet with therapists, counselors, support staff that reflect who they are. If you have a counseling center that has 3 white women and then Black men aren't showing up to ask for help, it may not be because Black men don't want help. It just might mean that they don't want help from that particular population, right? And so I think that there's some sort of pushing the conversation and dialogue of trying to understand a little bit, 1 degree lower, like, why are men not showing up? Is it because they just don't want help implicitly, or is it because the language we're using, the people we're bringing to the table may not meet them where they are? We do a ton of stuff around that. We sort of joke on our side of like, with men, you can build it and they won't come, right? And so a lot of what we try to do, and I think is really critical with any health promotion effort with young men, is like, you've got to be pounding the pavement. You can't do one event, and if they don't show up, think that they don't want it. Like, they really do need a lot of hand-holding, a lot of constant reminders and engagement. It doesn't mean that they won't get there, but they just need that engagement over time. I want to talk a little bit about some of the data we're finding, and I'm just conscious of time, and so we're going to move past a couple of slides. But these are some of the things we're seeing sort of from institutions across the country. This is one of my favorite slides because I think it speaks to the challenge of health promotion. You ask young men, this is a sample of a few hundred guys across the country, if they feel capable of managing their personal health and wellness. 92% of them agree with that statement, right? You go up to most young guys, hey, do you feel like you've got a good handle on health and well-being? They would say, yeah, right? And then in the same survey, 2 questions later, if you ask them, well, if you needed help, where would you go? They're like, I don't know. Like that's how quickly these things turn. And so I think that one of the things that we try to talk about a lot is like, where does stigma show up? And if you're having conversations with young men and they're saying, actually, I feel like the resources we have are good, or I feel like if they're saying one thing, but the outcomes are reflecting something different, it might be because of internalized stigma, internalized shame, some of that unhealthy masculinity that Steve was talking about earlier, right? So I think you have to really push past that level of, do you feel like you are capable of doing this, to really understanding like, where do you go and why would you go there? And would you go there if you needed help? And I think that's where a lot of men start to crumble a little bit, right? They'll say, I feel very confident in how I'm doing. And then when you say like, well, how are you doing? Then the conversation shifts, right? Couple reasons what we see in sort of manual members versus others, just in terms of why are guys not reaching out for mental health services. There's some element of feeling like they're too busy. I think that's probably fairly reflective of most college students. I do think a lot of young men are still feeling like they don't know where to go. And so when we talk about opportunities for health promotion professionals, like moving into the idea of like really reinvesting in outreach and advocacy and health promotion to young men beyond sort of new student orientation, et cetera. The next time you do a health promotion activity with your counseling department, like look who is out in the crowd. And if you're not seeing, male identifying students there, it might show up very simply in these guys. Like one of the reasons why a lot of these guys aren't reaching out for help doesn't have to do with stigma at all. They're just saying like, yeah, I didn't hear about it. Right. And that probably has to do with the efficacy of us getting in front of them and health promotions effort. And then of course, there's this big element of embarrassment, which we've talked about, and I don't need to repeat. I'll move past this. I don't need to talk about that. Last thing that I'll sort of talk about here is just sort of like some of the big questions we're hoping to ask. And I just share that because I hope that maybe you at your institution could sort of ask some of these same questions and then identify strategies based on that data. But I think that the three big areas we're focusing on are like, why are men not enrolling in college? What is the kind of messaging and support that we're sending to them that is saying, this isn't for me? One of the most stark statistics that I've seen in higher education, and you really have to like pause and to understand it, is we actually graduate less men from higher education today compared to women than we did women compared to men in the late 1960s, right? And when you talk about things like the gender pay gap and all of the issues that still plague us in society today, like we're catching up from that social ill from the 1960s. We're paying for that today. And so a lot of the challenges that we're seeing today, we're going to be seeing over the next few decades. Like I think the thing that scares me, and I think probably Steve, this is similar to you, is like I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. Like the data and the trends are suggesting that things are going in the wrong direction. And I think that's very scary. Same thing around why are men not using mental health services? And then of course, and happy to have more conversations about this, but what's going on with Black and Hispanic men and Indigenous men in these environments? Our 6-year graduation rate for Black men in higher education today is around 36%. That's not the 4-year rate, that's the 6-year rate. What kind of message does it send when Black men are coming to campuses, Hispanic men are coming to campuses, and we're telling them in 6 years you have a 1 in 3 shot of getting through this, right? That doesn't engender a lot of like excitement to be in that space, right? And so what can we do to begin to address that? Use health promotion as a mechanism to say you are welcome here. We want to make sure you're successful. We want to make sure you're healthy. Very genuinely, like the Black and Hispanic male and the Indigenous male graduation rate in college and higher education today, I think is one of the biggest travesties. I mean, it's really a disaster in terms of how well we are doing in responding to that problem, and then the corresponding investment we're making into it. And so I would encourage you, if not an interest in focusing on all men, trying to think about what can your institution at a minimum do to support Black, Hispanic, Indigenous men and their success. I think it's really important. And I think the data around men broadly is really scary, but especially within this population. So this is our contact information. I think we told Marlena and Jack we'd talk for like 20 or 25 minutes and we went way too long. So that's on us and probably me. But obviously a lot of data we wanted to share. And of course, if we can answer any follow-up questions that we're not able to answer in the next 25 or 30 minutes, I think you can contact us here. So yeah, I would love to move to questions. I'm sure Steve, you would as well. Marlena, do you want me to put up this survey now, or should we just, maybe I'll pull that up at like 12:55 and we can stop screen sharing? What's best?
Let's pull the last slide up at like 12:55.
Okay, sounds good.
But it has a feedback thing and then tells us about our next webinar. But for now, we can focus on just some questions.
Yeah,
So
and Jack, I'll just respond. I know it's not a question, more of a statement, but I'll say like I do think there are some really, really cool programs that are kind of creating these spaces that aren't, some of which we partner with, some of not, but I would really encourage everyone to look at like the Brotherhood Initiative at the University of Washington. They've been doing this for, I think, almost a decade. Their data is incredible, and it's a super supportive space, mostly focused on Black men, but I think men of color in general. And then we have a partnership with the Men of Color Academy at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. They're building something really cool. So there are, I think, these other spaces outside of like healthcare, right, that are creating places where men feel really safe and heard. Those are a couple examples of really cool programs to look at. I don't know, Steve, if you know of others on top of that, but when I think about like universities that are building great role models, peers, like the University of Oregon has a male resource center. I think of those kinds of institutions as doing a really interesting job in this space. And of course, what Steve's building, I think, speaks for itself.
Yeah, I would echo that, and just say, that within my within the work that I'm doing here at MSU-Denver, not only in terms of the classes that I have and the programs that I have, but I also have created men's groups, informal men's groups. I have created classes where men have opportunity to talk with the men. The one of the most wonderful is when you can get a man, a student who's 55 years old, and he's a military veteran, and he's talking to these 19 and 20-year-old boys. They are all ears, and they can't wait for one to hear, but to say their story, to tell, for someone to hear them. It's amazing. So you are right. We need more spaces like that. And that's the whole goal. I'm happy to help support in that way.
I have a question. So I'm Saker from the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio. And how do you talked a little bit about the stigma that's associated, especially with men trying to express and connect with their feelings and try to openly talk about that. How do you have the conversation of, yes, it's important to do that because it benefits not only yourself, but also the other individuals that you might have, professional relationships, personal relationships, just the people that are in your life. Like, how do you have those conversations so that they become more aware of the importance of making sure that they're taking care of themselves to have a positive impact on the people that they're connected with?
I think it's a great, I mean, Steve, I'll offer my perspective quickly, and then I'd love yours too. I mean, I think like one of, this is where I think that conversation around sort of positive masculinity versus sort of unhealthy masculinity is really interesting. Like a lot of young men want to be providers, right? Like that's something that they'll tell you. Like I want to be someone that is supportive to the community around me. Now, I think what a lot of young men are taught is the way to do that is be tough, be the stoic, silent person in the middle of the room. And so part of the conversation that we try to have is not, it's not saying that being a provider, if that's something that you prioritize, is inherently wrong, right? But maybe the ways in which this kind of gets into the, toxic masculinity that Steve wants to avoid, but like, the way that you think being a provider, is by being the tough one, to be silent. But actually, what would happen if you did have a mental health crisis, and if you don't take care of yourself today, you sort of, in a proactive manner, then maybe you won't be able to be there for the people around you. And I think that like there's some conversation there that I think is really interesting. And so for some of it, it's just like, I would say like really inviting men to explain what their priorities are, and then meeting them there and talking about why taking care of yourself and being, can be so beneficial to the people around you. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything else to add. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. So one is creating a safe space where men feel comfortable, and generally I do see that in a where it is single gender situation, that generally men will speak up. In a class where there's a lot of women, if we're talking about emotion, a lot of men will not say as much. However, if you do have a student who can model that, and I try to navigate that in my class, I know somebody who's going to share a little bit, I sort of foster that and cultivate that, but also beware of the overshare, because men who tend to overshare, other men will quickly realize, don't go there. They have their finger on the pulse of it much more than you think they might, and they're careful about wanting to go there as well. So I think that another way is starting with content to which they can relate, something to which they can kind of generate some discussion, and then touching in just with, what was your experience of that kind of thing. It really is a learned process for a lot of these guys. One of the things that I get a lot of feedback years later sometimes is nobody ever asked me that question. I have never had that thought before ever. And they were welcoming the opportunity to bring something forward that was locked in.
I think a good reminder based on that, Steve, is like, given a lot of the data that we're seeing, like, it's very possible that for many of these young men, this is the first space where they've ever had it is possible that they, just looking at some of the data around elementary, middle, high school teachers, single parent households, et cetera, like, you as a health professional, health promotion professional, and what you're putting together in the collegiate environment, it might be one of the first or only times that young men are, I love that question that you asked, like, that might be the first time that an 18 or 19-year-old guy has ever heard that kind of question, right? And I think that is, like, you have to understand the starting point here that a lot of these young guys are coming in with. And I'm overgeneralizing, right? But like, when you look at the female male high school teacher split, and when you look at the number of women that serve as mothers versus men that serve as single father, there's generally more of these conversations happening with young women in middle school, high school, et cetera. And so they're coming in with a greater openness to the kinds of emotional conversations that Sekar, that you just brought up. And men might be hearing it for the first time, right? And so just understanding what that would be like, and then trying to kind of meet them there, and then as Steve said, sort of bring them along. I hope that's helpful.
One of the things that I was thinking about was, this is a big issue, right? There's so many different things that we need to do to go upstream to kind of fix some of these issues. But one thing that stands out to me was in one of the first conversations that I had with Matt, he was talking about some of the language that he uses with manual. That has been a really easy shift for me to use whenever I'm doing some marketing. Like he said, instead of thinking of it from a improve your mental health, it'll be more of like a maximization, optimization kind of language. I'm curious, what are some of those other like small wins that you can easily implement today that don't take a lot of effort?
One word I don't use too much of is feminine energy, because a lot of men are afraid of that word, afraid of being labeled, and I often use the model of our yin, or our softness, or stepping back, sort of gentling the language a little bit that way, because men are very sensitive to being stigmatized, and so it is really, it's a challenge to navigate that and welcome them, because there's a lot of fear out there.
Yeah, and I don't know, Marlene, I don't know if this is a quick win, because I know there are challenges in this, right? That I don't understand the role I have, that I know you all are facing every day, but really taking a step back and saying, like, okay, over the last 12 months, I did XYZ number of in-person programs or virtual presentations. How often did I have a young man in those spaces being one of the presenters, right? And sharing their perspective. And I think when we, at least across the 40, 45 schools we work with, when we've done that exercise, we found that they might look at the last 3 or 4 programs and, the health promotion staff was primarily female, the peer, a lot of universities have peer programs. When they look at who typically are in those peer programs, it's primarily women. So I know that's not I know that can be difficult to change, right? But I think when I've seen other institutions do a really good job of this, like, well, where are there men in our institution that might want to participate in some of these things? Can I go grab a coach, right? Who's really, like we work with Elmhurst University and they have like a super, just like really, really inspiring. He's the lacrosse coach there, and he mental health is a huge priority for him, right? So he's not the first person that you wouldn't be like, oh, let's go find the lacrosse coach to do our mental health promotion event, around mental health. Like that probably would be not the first person you think of, maybe not, but that's probably not the number one, guy on your list. But can we pull someone like that for, if our staff maybe is primarily female or our counseling staff is primarily female, like, are there other, individuals in the institution that we, faculty members, people like Steve, are those kinds of people that we can bring to these kinds of events and efforts to sort of, decrease that stigma within that population? That would be another, maybe it's quick-ish kind of win, but how do you sort of add that kind of voice into the conversation? I think could really matter.
Quick question following up on that. I think of spaces that I have been invited into, like from coaches or Greek life presidents, groups like that, and they don't know what to ask for. So they'll ask, well, what are the wellness resources? And they think that as long as we tell the students where to go, they will go there. But so what is the conversation that you recommend if we get invited into those spaces where young men are? Because we're kind of a guest coming into there, but we don't want to necessarily ostracize or make them uncomfortable with the message that we have to say in that space too. Is there anything or curriculum that people are looking for us to come into that space when they invite us?
My 2 quick ideas, and then Steve, I'm sure you'll add. One would be, if you can like pre-identify a champion to sort of signal to that group that you've been invited to the space, it makes a big difference. I mean, we work with a lot of Greek life organizations, and the difference in how glazed over the guys are when the IFC president says, hey guys, Matthew's here, you need to pay attention to this. This is important to me, versus when they're just like, this is Matthew, good luck. When that's the way I'm introduced, done, game over. I like know it's going to be a 2-minute conversation. They're going to glaze over. They're going to say, hey, what kind of questions do you have? There's none, whatever. When it's the IFC president or whoever, whatever that influencer is in that space saying, pay attention to this, then it's an hour-long conversation. They're asking those sorts of questions, et cetera. The second piece I would do is like, this sounds really silly, but one of the things that the guys ask us for the most is like, be very tactical about the advice you're like, they want to hear like literally like role model to me how I would ask for help. If I were to call the counseling center, what is the sentence I say, right? And just going back to that kind of like the piece that I was saying earlier about, they may have never seen a man ask for help in their entire life. And so I've had a lot of conversations with guys where they're like, yeah, I'm with you. Like if I need help, like stigma's gone. I'm 19. I'm with it. Like mental health, good. All like they're there on those topics. And then when you get to that conversation about like, okay, so like, what would you do if you needed help? They'd be like, I actually don't know the words I would utter. And so like, imagine how difficult that would be if you were a guy saying, I know I need help, but I literally have never seen someone in my life that's like me ask for help. Now I have to go do it in practice. And so some of the conversations we just have are like, like, what would it be like if you wanted to check in on a buddy of yours who was struggling with a drinking problem? Like literally, what are the words that you say in order to check in on that person? Or if I wanted to call the counseling center and say, hey, I need help, what is the sentence I would use? Like go very, very tactical there versus like more conceptual, like here's where it is, here are what the resources are, like actually walk them through the process. I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think about health influencers and sort of looking at not necessarily the content of what health influencers provide, but the style of them, because they are really, they're reaching young men. I mean, as a physician, I can tell you that it's frustrating when we have young men who are getting more of their information from the health influencer than from somebody who's trained. And so, but I think looking at their style, and I think that one of the things that Matthew brings up is very quick. 3 tips. Here are 3 suggestions. Here are 2 practical ideas. Here's one thing that I've used very successfully. That kind of thing tends to be used a lot, and I think it could be very helpful instead of, as Matthew was saying, the conceptual perspective. I love to talk about that, and I do in my classes. I can lecture on that for hours, but that's actually not necessarily what they want to hear. They want a little bit more concise suggestion. I might also add, there are people out there in the community, and I think in the form of men and women, but there are a lot of men who really can identify with what we're talking about, and looking for their dollars. They really do want to contribute and support. And so looking at ways to fund some programs, I think is really important. The money is not out there institutionally. We know that federally there are no federal dollars going to men's health. There are over 6 national federally funded programs, including Health and Human Services, CDC, HRSA, SAMHSA. They all have federally funded dollars for women's health, and there are $0 for. And I think that trickles down. And I think, asking of that from the community, there are men and women out there who say, yeah, this makes a difference. I really would like to see this.
And see, I mean, even at MSU-Denver for our 2nd year, it was initially funded, just manual as an example, the president initially funded as part of sort of a challenge grant, et cetera. But then when we were thinking about extended funding, like there was not, to Steve's point, necessarily like government dollars. It wasn't necessarily something that somebody like MSU-Denver had sort of institutionalized, but we were able to go, the development office went to a foundation in the community that was like, oh, I see the data and this is a problem. And we want to figure out how to, get more healthy men coming out into the Denver and the Colorado community more broadly. And so it's kind of it was, I don't think Steve thought he was going to be writing a foundation grant to do, men's, but there was, creative funding out there, but you may have to think, outside of where you traditionally would go to those sort of funding avenues. And hopefully those things change over time. But I'd say at least today, like those are, smart ways to kind of make the approach, whether it be for manual or literally anything else that you're hoping to do around sort of men's health, men's engagement.
All right, I don't know if we have any more questions, but thank you so much, Matt and Steve, for sharing all this information with us today. Matt, if you want to pull up the last slide of the PowerPoint. So we do have a survey that you can take to let us know what you want to see in the future, what you thought. And then I also wanted to let you all know that our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 17th at noon in Central Time. And it'll be engaging faculty and supporting student well-being and facilitated by Jennifer Jacobson. And we'll have the registration details available soon. For today's feedback, you can scan the QR code or put in this URL. It looks like the R got messed up on the line. But thank you again, Matt and Steve.